I have the honor of introducing tonight's guest speaker, Jennifer Clement. Mrs. Clement grew up in Mexico City. She studied English literature and anthropology at NYU, and then French literature in Paris. She's written 4 novels: The Widow Basquiat, A True Story Based on Lies, The Poison That Fascinates, and of course, Prayers for the Stolen. Prayers for the Stolen is a captivating novel that focuses on issues such as human trafficking, poverty, and the lives of women in Guerrero, Mexico. Personally, I could go on for days talking about this novel. I read it over the weekend, and normally I'm a slow reader, but I could not put this book down. I think we'd all rather that Mrs. Clement take the stage now and talk about her novel. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I just want to say how happy I am to be here and to thank Ellen Toscana for inviting me, and just to say that I feel like I am a part of NYU. Everything that I do today was forged at NYU. I went as a freshman to Tisch School of the Arts to study dance. And after doing that for a year, I had to audition in Chicago in a huge ballroom. I realized that it was not for me, that it just was not intellectual enough. And so I transferred to the Gallatin division, where I was able to form a major that was English, because Gallatin allows you to do your own major. So I did a major that was anthropology and English literature, which allowed me to study literature, but also take creative writing courses and also do anthropology. I did 2 internships while I was at NYU, one with Viking Penguin Books and one at the American Museum of Natural History. So I was writing the 2 sides of anthropology and writing all the time. And actually my studies in Paris were an internship with NYU in Paris. So I would read all the French, again, so important in my life today, because I was reading all the novels that have to do with social issues in France, and Balzac and Victor Hugo and Zola. And that was all for NYU as well. And I would send my papers to New York and show that I was studying these novels while I was in Paris. So today, here I am, writing novels, but that also entail quite a bit of anthropology, or the anthropologist's eye, to go into these settings and examine and see what I'm looking at, to be able to write my novel. So all that happened at NYU. And another thing that happened in NYU is that I went there in 1978, and I became part of that early 80s art scene in New York, and I met Jean-Michel Basquiat's girlfriend of the time. I don't know how many people in this room know who he was. Raise hands. Well, he's probably the only Black American painter who's made it really big time. And in fact, one of my chapters is called No Black Men in Museums. And so anyway, he died of an overdose of heroin, and his paintings now sell for $50 million at auction. And he's huge, and there's stories in it about Madonna, who in those days was a bartender. Everybody knows who Madonna was, right? And so I wrote a memoir, which is Widow Basquiat, about those early days in New York at NYU. But I wrote it after I graduated. At the time, I wrote a lot of poetry about her and the time. So just moving on to Prayers for the Stolen, basically it's a novel that took about 11 years of research. It was Ernest Hemingway who used to talk about the iceberg of research that sits under a novel. So in my case, there's an enormous iceberg of research that sits under the novel. I started out just being very interested in drug culture, Mexican drug culture. And so I started out interviewing women who were in hiding and were trying to get away from their boyfriends or husbands or fathers or brothers who were drug traffickers. And they were in this kind of underground world of where women are hidden, which is all over the country. And then I did that for about 2 years, and I wrote several journalistic pieces on drug culture. And then I was president of PEN Mexico. PEN is a human rights organization. It's probably one of the oldest in the world. It was founded in England 91 years ago. And Mexico was one of the first countries to join. But we had never had to be as a center preoccupied with issues in Mexico. But suddenly, with the escalation of the drug war, so many journalists were being killed in Mexico that as president of PEN, I had to deal with that. We have over 75 journalists killed and at least 20 missing. And nobody in Mexico is in jail for having killed a journalist. So I sort of had to do 3 years completely devoted to that and creating a campaign to bring worldwide awareness to the problem, because we needed the world on board. And one of the main things about that campaign was to try to change the law, because at that time, and up until just 2 years ago, to kill a journalist was a state crime, not a federal crime. And so as president of PEN and with other organizations, we managed to change that law, which is a huge thing. So then I did that. And then the third part of the research was I'd heard that girls were being stolen and hidden in holes in the cornfields. And that really was the image that gave birth to the novel. And then the fourth part of the research was spending a lot of time in Mexico City's women's jail. And the third part of the novel takes place in the women's jail in Mexico City. So what has happened with this book is that it seems, without my knowing it, it wasn't my intention, that I wrote a novel of social protest. You know, historically, there have been great novels of social protest that have actually changed laws and changed the world. I mean, certainly if we think of Oliver Twist, that changed child labor laws. If we think of Jane Eyre, that changed property laws for women. So even though I was writing about something that just broke my heart, it turns out that it has had this other life. So sometimes I'm reading from it at a literary event, and sometimes I'm reading from it at a human rights, on a human rights panel. So it suddenly has these two lives. And in fact, it won a humanitarian award, and it has won a literary award. It won the National Endowment of the Arts, and it won the Sarah Curry Humanitarian Award. So even it's been awarded in these two different areas. So what this means is that the arts do have a place and a voice within the world of social activism and issues that matter to us. So I thought I'd take a minute and just read to you the little section that has to do with the holes. So this is the image that gave birth to the book, speaking to women in these rural parts of Guerrero, which is where Acapulco is. It's sort of in the middle of the country, close to the coast. Yeah. Which women? The women of Guerrero or the women in hiding? In hiding? Well, that's a good question. I know several people and a very important criminal lawyer who knew where the hiding places were. And so I would have to go into those situations. I'd have to set it up ahead of time through this network of a lawyer and a few people that had these shelters, including religious groups and human rights groups. So I would go into those situations. I'd have to say that I was there. I had 2 cellular telephones. I would go in, talk to the women, and then come out and once again have to be in contact with cellular telephones. It was very dangerous work, because if the drug traffickers found out that you knew where their women were or their children were, I mean, it's dangerous knowledge to know where they are. So I did it for about 2 years, and then this criminal lawyer, who's a very interesting lawyer, which I can discuss a little bit of his work later, because it does have to do with the United States and Mexico. You know, he was the one who finally said to me, you just can't do this anymore, because I started doing that under our President Fox, and then we had the next president was President Calderon, who did this escalation that he himself called the war against drugs, and then now we have a new president. So it was under this previous president that it looks like over 120,000 people were killed in this war on drugs, which is insane for us in Mexico, because the way that we view it from there is that the United States and Mexico are in a terrible, terrible marriage. So the consumption of drugs is in the United States. It's an 100 billion industry a year, the consuming of illegal drugs. And the amount of guns that go to Mexico illegally and legally from the United States, mostly illegally, represents 47% of the small gun business of dealers of the United States. So if you just think about that mathematics, there's no way that Mexico can solve its problem without the United States getting involved in a real way. So the guns that cross, the drugs that cross, and now we have the trafficking of people too. Mexico doesn't have good statistics or methodology to know how many people are being sold and trafficked, but the United States does. And so, for example, just in the city of Atlanta, Georgia, the numbers are 300 girls are at risk a month to be trafficked. Just in Atlanta, Georgia, one city. So it's a scourge. And it's one thing that I have realized with writing this book and talking about it all over the world is that the problem of the trafficking of women and young girls is all over the world in different forms, but it's happening everywhere. In all kinds of different ways, be it the stealing of girls in Nigeria, being the abortion of girls in India. I mean, the statistics in India are there are 50 million girls missing over all this time. 50 million girls have been aborted or killed as children. So it's happening in all kinds of ways, but the trafficking and violence against women is a huge problem.
So the women who you spoke to in hiding, they obviously had been through a lot emotionally. Were they reluctant in talking to you or nervous? Did they have help like psychologically?
Okay, the one thing that I found across the board that's very moving is that everybody wants to tell their story. And it's quite an amazing thing how we as people want to tell our story. So I think they were always astonished, even in jail, that somebody wanted to hear about their life. And so I never found it to be a problem. Sometimes they'd be ashamed of things they had done because in some cases they had disposed of bodies in vats of acid or done things like this. So they were not proud of telling those things. Okay, so, sorry, did somebody else have something?
I was just wondering, Ladydi's mother, how much of that was inspired by fiction, or how much of that was based off of real stories that you had heard?
Okay. It's all fiction, except that there is this underground thing. So, for example, how does a creative writer deal with this, or how do I deal with this? To begin with, I have a little trouble even with the word research, because when I go into these situations, be it to interview a woman in hiding or the jail or whatever, I'm always going in as a poet. So I'm always looking for the poetic experience. I'm not going in as an investigative journalist, although I've done pieces like that, but I'm more looking for the poetic experience. So, for example, to give one example, there are two women that I know of who are in their 70s who have both received babies that were thrown in the garbage. And I've heard about these women all my life. And it's always been something to me so incredible that a baby could be thrown in the garbage, like just trash. So that's knowledge that I have. In the novel, I take that knowledge to this woman who was a garbage baby. She smells like, old oranges, rotten oranges, and she was wrapped with a dead parrot, and she's got broken eggshells in her hair. I mean, that becomes the poetic experience. So I can take something that has to do with knowledge, but I transform it into poetry that way. So there's that kind of knowledge in a lot of things, but it's all becoming transformed. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay, so this is another transformation. I heard from these mothers because I actually never met a daughter who was stolen and returned. So that's my imagination as a novelist that can bring her back so she can tell the story of what happened to her. But I would meet with mothers. So mothers would tell me how they had dug a hole in the cornfield, and if they saw the SUVs coming with the drug traffickers that were coming to steal their girls, they would hide their girls in these holes. So that's the truth. And what I'm going to read now is the completely poetic experience of that truth. So here goes. Run and hide in the hole. What did you say, Mama? Run and hide in the hole right now. Hush. What? Hush, hush. My mother had been outside when she saw a tan-colored SUV in the distance. More than actually seeing it, she heard it. There had been a silence in the jungle as the insects and birds grew still. Quick, she said, run, run. I ran out the front door toward the small clearing at the side of the house and under a small palm tree. The hole was covered with dry palm fronds. I moved the fan-like leaves to one side and scrambled in. From inside, I reached for the fronds and pulled them back over the opening. The hole was too small. My father had dug it up when I was 6 years old. I had to lie down on my side with my knees at my chest, like skeletal remains of ancient burials I'd seen on television. I could see slivers of light peer in on me through the thatch of leaves. I heard the sound of a motor approach. The ground above me trembled as the SUV drove up to our small house and stopped in the clearing, right above the hole and above me. My small space became dark as I lay in the shadow of the vehicle. Through the leaves, I could see the SUV's underbelly, a web of tubes and metal. Above me, the motor was turned off. I could hear the sound of the handbrake as it was cranked into place. The car door opened on the driver's side. One brown cowboy boot with a high but square and manly heel stepped out of the car. Those boots did not belong to this land. No one wore boots like that in this heat. As he stood with the car door open, he looked straight at my mother. From the hole, I could see his boots and her red plastic flip-flops face each other. Good day, Mother, he said. The man's voice did not belong to this land. The boots and his voice were from the north of Mexico. Is it always this hot here, he asked. How hot do you think it is? My mother did not answer. Ah, Mother, put down that gun. The other car door opened. I could not swivel in my hole to try and look around, so I just listened. From the passenger side of the SUV, another man stepped out. Do you want me to shoot her missing? The second man asked. He coughed and wheezed after he spoke. He had an asthmatic voice from the desert, a voice of rattlesnakes and sandstorms. Where's your daughter, huh? The first man asked. I don't have a daughter. Ah, yes, you do. Don't lie to me, Mother. I heard a bullet hit the SUV. The vehicle shook above me. I heard the brat-tat-tat explosion of machine gun fire, along with the sound of the bullets breaking up the adobe brick walls of our home. Then it stopped. The jungle swelled and contracted. Insects, reptiles, and birds stilled, and nothing rubbed against anything. The sky darkened. The machine gun had fired the wind out of the mountain. We were your best hope, Mother, the first man said. I birthmarked the place, didn't I? I heard the second man say through a shrill wheeze that became a whistle. The two men got back in the car and slammed the doors shut. The driver turned the key and started the motor. When he placed his boot on the accelerator above me, my hole was filled with the vehicle's exhaust fumes. I opened my mouth and breathed in the noxious smoke. The car backed up and drove off down the path. I breathed deeply. I took in the poison as if it were the smell of a flower or fruit. My mother made me spend the next 2 hours in that hole. You're not coming out until I hear a bird sing, she said. It was almost dark when she pulled the fronds off the hole and helped me out. Our little house was sprayed with dozens of bullets. Even the papaya tree had bullet wounds, and sweet sap oozed from the holes in the soft bark. Just look at that, my mother said. I turned. She was pointing at the hole with her finger. I peered in and saw 4 albino shell scorpions there, the deadliest kind. Those scorpions showed you more mercy than any human being ever will, my mother said. She took off one of her flip-flops and killed all 4 in beating blows. Mercy is not a two-way street, she said. So that's a passage that's based on the holes, but taken to my imagination where I'm imagining all this. But I do have to have the knowledge of the difference between drug culture in the north of Mexico and the difference between drug culture in a place like Acapulco, Guerrero. And another thing that interests me very much as a writer, which, those who are in my workshops in the next few days, I'm very interested in dialogue as well as the prose. So you'll notice that all my dialogue is dialogue that never has like banality to it. Even the drug trafficker says, I birthmarked the place. I'm always looking for dialogue that has the standard of a playwright. So everything is sort of looked at through the eyes of poetry, through the eyes of literature, even though it's based on fact. So I had to study a lot about the difference between the drug cultures because when Paula is stolen, she's taken to the north of Mexico to the drug culture that's up there. I don't know, have any of you heard about the killing of women in Ciudad Juarez? Raise your hands if anybody has. Yeah. Well, this has been a big scandal and a terrible tragedy, but even though violence encompasses the whole country, there are different kinds of violence. Even those women have been subjected to a different kind of abduction and violence than, say, the girls in Guerrero. So a lot of people will ask me, how does it compare to Ciudad Juarez? Well, it's a quite different situation that's going on. In Ciudad Juarez, they are women that are working on the border factories and are very vulnerable because they don't have families. And it has seemed to be some sort of a trafficking mafia there that could have been specifically to do with the border. So does anybody have any questions? No? Yeah.
You seem to try to look at everything from the poetic experience. Do you try to poeticize it? Do you do it for aesthetic appeal or technical appeal to the human aspect of it? Why do you try to heighten that aspect of the world? Because it could just be an objective journalistic experience.
Because as a writer, to write a book of literature as opposed to just the facts, like a journalistic account, what I'm interested, and this is where the poetic experience comes in, I'm interested in how the divine and the profane coexist, and how beauty and ugliness coexist, and how there is God and there is no God. So I can do that as a poet, but if I were just to tell the facts, I wouldn't be able to bring in this whole side of the contradiction and be able to be constantly playing. I'm constantly playing with what is divine and what is profane, what is beautiful, what is ugly, what is joyful, what is sad. I'm always looking for the duality of experience, which exists. It exists. You just have to be able to go into those situations and see it, and then sometimes invent it. In the jail, I used to go the only person who's based on a real person is the collage workshop teacher. And he's an artist in Mexico, and he gives collage workshops in the jail. And one thing that's so fascinating about a collage, and it's literally magazines, kindergarten scissors, glue, and cardboard, is that these women, since they don't have an education or they're severely traumatized, I mean, if they go to the poetry workshop, they're not able to write a poem. Or if they go to the art workshop, they really can't do art. Or even the computer workshop, or going back to high school classes, all that is really hard for them to do. But the collage workshop is very easy, and they're able to express themselves in these collages. And it was so moving. And here is an example of the poetic experience, is that I met a woman in there who had been what we call a mule, which means that somebody set her up to cross some drugs across the border. But she just sold tacos on the beach in Oaxaca. And she was she didn't even know how to read or write. And so she was caught and put in the women's jail in Mexico City. And her collages, everything that she looked for in the magazines were sea images. So her collages were starfish and beaches and sand in this cement building full of criminals. And to me, that's a poetic experience, when I see somebody an illiterate person making a collage of their beach where they used to sell tacos, So, so I guess I don't know if that helps answer your question, but I even go in searching for what does it smell like, what does it taste like. I mean, the whole sensuous part of the experience. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
My question is kind of going off that. You say that you approach these issues as a poet and not a journalist. Some might say that in dealing with topics that are so complex and heavy, it's best to remain objective and to tell the story as it really is. Do you worry that in fictionalizing and poeticizing these stories, you kind of take the story away from real people and real stories that might not need to be embellished?
I don't, actually. I think that one thing, because of the journey of this book, it's been sort of two journeys. I've had the literary journey, and the unexpected human rights journey. So, for example, I was just in Berlin. I presented the book in Berlin, and it was a very literary presentation. But then the night before, I was on a panel of how to eradicate violence against women. And in Finland, this happened very much. I mean, I was presenting the book as a literary work, and then in the evening, I would be at all these roundtables with lawyers, human rights experts, people who had shelters for trafficked women. And I think, if anything, the experience has underscored the need for the arts to be a part of this discussion. There is a place for it. And I think that people perhaps are weary of the statistics, of the journalistic expose, or a lawyerly expose, or figures and numbers. I think what the arts can do, not just literature, but I think all the arts can bring a humanistic side to these issues, which are such pressing issues of our time. And I have to say, I'm really happy to see so many, men in this audience, because my experience is that we're always preaching to the choir, and what women need men to be defending them and on board, for all the women that work with the trafficking and violence against women. For all of us, Nicholas Kristof is our hero. He's the person that writes for the New York Times on these issues. Unfortunately, not about America, but about Europe and Africa and Asia. And, everybody's always quoting him. Everything I go to, it's Nicholas Kristof said this, and he's like the only man who's a face on the issue. And so now I've got, I'm on the human rights side of the book saying this. But it's really great to see young men here tonight, and unusual. Yeah. Yes.
The human rights aspect and the literary aspect. In the story, some of the characters actually do venture into the United States, and there's a recent statistic just came out that 80% of all women who cross the border from Mexico or Central America are sexually assaulted. And given that statistic, some of the decisions your characters in the novel make to still venture to the United States, to me, it spoke volumes of how like drastic the things that they were experiencing were. And it kind of shocked me at the end of at the point that the characters made that decision, because I thought perhaps that wouldn't be their decision given what they already knew about it. And I was wondering maybe if you could explore why they still made that decision ultimately, knowing what they knew and some of the other characters who had already experienced the journey into the United States.
Yeah, well, I think that's a very perceptive question. I don't think I should answer it because there are people that have not read the book. And it's so interesting to me how differently that end is read. I thought that I had written an obvious ending, but now I realize it wasn't so obvious because this question keeps coming up. But I think for those, I mean, I'd be happy to talk about it afterward, but I think for those who haven't read it, you know, in a sense, it'll spoil their interpretation of the end. But certainly, you know, the crossing of the whole thing to do with the Mexico-U.S. border is a huge topic that I'm very informed about. It used to be that crossing the border was like a sort of family business, and your uncle Juan would help you cross the border. It's been completely taken over by the drug cartels. And so crossing the border has become an incredibly dangerous thing. And they have learned, as is learned all over the world, that you can only sell a bag of drugs once, but you can sell a human being many times, and you can traffic a woman many times, even many times in one day. You can prostitute her. So it's the gift that keeps giving. So actually, they make more money trafficking people. I know families who have been decimated because somebody has been kidnapped, and they just say, okay, sell your house, now sell your car, now sell everything you have. And, you know, they've been totally ruined because it's extortion and kidnapping or sex trafficking. And in New York, because I know a lot of people at the Mexican consulate there, a lot of the women are trafficked from an indigenous language, from areas like Chiapas or Oaxaca, straight into English. They haven't even gone through Spanish, you know, which is like doubly sort of horrific. You know, it's just like, just to imagine that, it's just so terrible. You know, they haven't even gone through Spanish yet. So, and then there's the second thing that's happened at the border, which is this enormous wall that was started by Bill Clinton. And the way that it's devised is that it forces everybody to go who wants to cross through the Arizona desert. So now for the first time in the past, 5 years, 7 years, we're getting tremendous deaths in the Arizona desert because that's the only place you can get through that fence, which was done on purpose. It was no accident. So that's another element that's very complicated about the border. The most crossed border in the world is the Mexican-U.S. border. And if you look on your Google Maps and you look at the border on your computers, you will see on the American side of the border, gun shop, 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 gun shop. So the amount of guns that are coming into Mexico is just astronomical.
You spoke earlier about I think it was the New York Times journalist who was writing about the issue of human trafficking and how he was the only male voice on the issue. Why do you think that it's so important that the issue of women trafficking have a male voice and a male face to the issue?
Well, because these men have daughters, have wives, have mothers. I mean, they are, in general, the people that are trafficking and using women. And there is a culture of silence among men about this. And it has to be changed. Yeah.
You spoke a lot about the women you spoke to in jail, who I imagine are working as mules and traffickers, and there's even this statistic here about 62% of traffickers are women. I was wondering if you could speak more about that. Are they often coerced into that work, or they've made that decision in order to escape being trafficked themselves, or yeah?
Sorry, I didn't really understand the
Well, if you could
question.
just if you could just go into more depth about how they end up in those
There's
positions.
many ways that they're trafficked. Sometimes they're just stolen, as in my novel, I talk about that. But sometimes they're coerced. And there was even a campaign, which is actually incredible, in Jalisco. There was a government campaign called Beware of Love. And these pimps, what they do is they actually marry girls. And so there are men who have married 300 girls, or 350 girls, to get them across the border as their wives, and then they traffic them. And so the girls are going sometimes willingly, thinking that they're marrying somebody. So there's many ways, and some have debt bondage, which they're in debt, and so they have to pay back their debt. And some are slaves. They just take their passport away, and they're locked up, and they're used as slaves. So there's many sort of facets to how the trafficking occurs. In my book, it's just little girls in rural places of Mexico that are, literally just stolen out of their houses, off the street, coming out of the movies, at the market. And because the local police is involved, nothing happens. I mean, one of the things that I've thought a lot about is, and this also has to do with the question that you asked about getting men involved, is how can we make women more valuable? How can we give women more status? I mean, I think that's something we have to all think about, because how can it be that in Mexico, which is a third world country and not, it's also a first world country depending on where you are, how can it be that if I go to a police station and I say my car was stolen, my car, it's a drama. Oh, your car. What make? What color? What's the license plate? Where did you park it? How long has it been gone? I mean, to have your car stolen is a big deal. It's a car. But if you go and say they stole my daughter, oh yeah, she's probably with her boyfriend. Come back in 2 days. It's not important. So there's a status thing, and this we see obviously. I mean, in places like China and India, it's tremendous. Even Saudi Arabia, you can't. If you're a woman, you can't drive a car. They sent me this photograph of a Volkswagen covered in a burqa. You can't drive a car. Yeah.
Okay, so my question is, you spoke about the poetry of your book. What more, as an audience, do you feel we get reading this as a book of poetry as opposed to a journalistic article?
Okay, another thing that you get, and this has been a very difficult thing for the publicity departments of the book to try and convey to the audience, is that poetry makes it readable. It allows me to give breath, it allows me to give humor, and it allows me to give the reader the poetic experience. So what the critics have said about the book is that it's absolutely enchanting. That how can such a difficult book be enchanting? Well, one of the things that I was able to do, which of course fiction can do, is the second part of the book, the middle part, is a love story. She falls in love with the gardener, and if the book were music, it gives you a great feeling of breath. It relaxes you to be able to continue reading, and also it makes me able to talk about falling in love. And in all my books, everybody falls in love at first sight. I can't tell you how many discussions I have about, do you really believe in love at first sight? And I really do, I guess, because it's always in my novels. Everybody's falling in love at first sight. So she sees the gardener, and it's just like, boom, she falls in love immediately just by looking at him. And so that gives the reader and the writer, because to me, it's just such great enjoyment to give her that love story. And that's the other thing for me as a writer. I mean, I don't know how many of you are writing right now, but I am always deeply in love with my characters. I mean, it's not something distant from me like, oh, Paula or oh, Ladydi. I feel them very close. I feel like they're my daughters. Even the men, I love all the men in the book. I think the men are very special. The book is actually a lot about the pain of living without men. And it's a terrible thing. These women have lost their men either because they've gone to the United States and they have new families in the United States, which is devastating for the family left behind, or they go to another state looking for work and leave their families, or they are victims of crime and they're dead, or they simply have stopped protecting their women. And this has had a devastating effect on the women. And I really wanted to portray the pain of that abandonment in all its levels. It doesn't work to have worlds without men or worlds without women. It doesn't, it's not good.
In terms of analysis of human character and human nature, what do you think about the geographical reality of the people you describe, or the social, cultural context, or the clash between cultures that could perpetuate the moral lapse that allows the characters to do things like the pimps that marry all these girls and do all these things? Where do you think lies the fault that doesn't stop the crime from going on from a human perspective, from someone saying, I cannot do this, it is wrong?
Well, for one, there's complete impunity, at least in many of these countries. These crimes go unpunished. Or is that what you're asking?
Yeah, sort of why they can keep happening time and time again without people sort of
Well, in Mexico, it's because the rule of the law doesn't rule. There's complete impunity, and the police and the legal system is infiltrated on a state level, and maybe even higher, by interests that have to do with the mafias infiltrating all areas. And then I think, again, to this question of how can we make women more valuable? How can we make women have greater status? I mean, I don't know, all of you, if you remember when they killed that girl, I think it was in Afghanistan. She was raped, but they killed her for adultery, but she was raped, but the crime was adultery, and she was 13 years old. And they kept shooting her and shooting her and shooting her. It's like, why so much hate? I mean, we just see right now in Nigeria, where are these girls? Where are they? Who has them? And I mean, you just look everywhere you look, there is this problem where women are not valued. And women learn patriarchy too. I mean, in India, the people that are having abortions are the women. Same in China. The women are aborting their girl babies. So women are part of the problem too. It's complex and simple.
Hearing all these prolific stories firsthand in your research, do you find that it takes an emotional toll on you personally, trying to get their story out there and get all the facts straight, or does it just motivate you more?
I don't know. It's a hard question. I'm always writing about what doesn't let me go. So, and now I have enough books to be able to kind of have a sweeping view of myself, because it's hard to know yourself. And I can see that in all my books, it's always about the unprotected. Even Widow Basquiat, which is a memoir, is about the unprotected. I mean, these were kids who were 20 years old that went to New York. They were unprotected. They got involved in things that they couldn't handle. They both were badly abused by their fathers, badly abused. So there's something in me that for reasons I can't explain, I have to write about what really, really doesn't let me sleep at night.
Hi.
back here.
Hi.
I haven't had the pleasure yet of reading your novel, so I just have a question in response to some of the ideas you were sharing earlier about the poetic image, and there were a few other follow-up questions. I guess I'm thinking that the poetic image is as essential to fiction and poetry as it is to nonfiction, to literary nonfiction in particular. I can only imagine it's your experience with the memoir you wrote. But also, I think of writers like Kapuscinski or Cynthia Ozick or James Baldwin. I can think of many nonfiction writers for whom the poetic image exists in real life and is essential to communicating with an audience. What I imagine is different with regard to fiction and to poetry and the novel is that the range of the narrator, the range of perspective, maybe is wider, more expansive, more imaginative. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to the construction of your narrator in your work.
Well, that's true, since I do both. But when I do creative nonfiction, which I've done a lot of, I'm also looking for the poetic experience. But I have to rein myself in because it has to have, fact check standard. So I can't invent, but I can push it, and I'm always doing that because that's the challenge for me to be able to try and write about, like, for example, the decision of one of the pieces that I wrote. One of the things that the Mexican army does with confiscated guns and rifles and machine guns and all that is they use them for filler to fill in the roads around the army barracks. So my poetic mind, imagine, I'm already walking on all the crimes you can imagine. I mean, I could just go so crazy with that. But if I'm doing creative nonfiction, I can bring it up that as I walk, I know that I'm walking on guns and I'm walking on rifles and I can't see them, and that I'm probably walking on crimes, weapons that were used for crimes. But I have to rein it in. I can't go to the full poetic place of literally imagining the crimes,
You can under the guise, I mean, if you're speculating.
If I'm speculating, yeah. But I mean, it's just to try and sort of explain, one, I could go there because for me, it's a very intense poetic image. So if I do it in fiction, I can go really crazy. And if I'm doing it with creative nonfiction, I can do it, but I just have to, hold on to the reins of that horse and not gallop, So. And then just to end a bit about the narrative voice. Her voice came to me, Ladydi's voice. It's in the first person. Her voice, I really didn't know that she was going to tell the story. It was sort of a surprising thing, which also happens when you work creatively, that it is mysterious. I mean, people always talk about it as being mysterious, and it sort of is, because a voice, you can start to hear this voice in your mind. And the thing that trapped me so much about her voice is that she just didn't expect anything better. It was just complete acceptance of her situation, unsentimental, just this is the way it is. And I found that voice really interesting. And the other thing, just to talk about what somebody else asked, another thing that I'm very interested that the poetic experience allows me to do, I'm very interested in how people who have no power and people who are unprotected exercise power and even exercise revenge. And they do it everybody in those situations does this. And so in fiction, I'm able to really, for example, Ladydi's mother, she loves revenge. She just thinks revenge is the best thing, So I'm able to play with that, something that I see in real life, but I'm able to, really have a lot of fun with that. You? Yes.
Just have a question about writing. As a writer, how do you train yourself to have a better and broader imagination of the subjects you're writing on?
Yeah, well, what I've noticed over time is that when I was younger, I was controlling more. I was more controlling of every line. I work very much line by line. I care about every line. But as I've gotten older, I've been able to trust. I guess it's the only word I can use, to trust sort of a kind of acceptance of the unconscious part of my mind to come in more and sort of be looser, you know. Does that make sense?
In China, most of the women works in, I guess, commercial sex industry are willing to work in the industry. Um, but as you said earlier, so in Mexico, the women are kidnapped or human trafficked.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so um, does I was wondering, does your book um does your book like begin a movement or a organization in Mexico that can, like, I guess, educate the man more, like, instead of, I mean, save the women? I guess the better thing to do is to educate the men who are willing to, go to those places and,
Well, it's kind of a twofold question. What is happening uh, in Europe and I'm not so up on it, but I do know that in England and this very interesting judge in New York State have started to realize that the men that go to prostitutes should also be criminalized. Because what the research shows is that there are practically no women who do this because they want to do it. That's also a myth. In general, they do it because they don't have education, they don't have a choice, they're poor, they have children, but almost nobody is doing it because they want to be doing it. So even the women in China that might be doing it legally, it's maybe prostitution isn't illegal. I don't know if that's what you're saying, or you're just saying that they choose to be prostitutes. What the research shows is that actually it's always the last desperate choice. These movements of having the men also be criminalized are very interesting, and for obvious reasons, they're new things that are happening, to see both people in the act as committing the crime. In England, prostitution was legal forever. I don't know if it's illegal now, but there is this big movement because they realized that almost all prostitutes were trafficked women. So there was no real such thing as like the prostitute that wanted to be a prostitute. And then in terms of the book in Mexico, it's really been interesting what's happened to the book in Mexico because, and maybe I can answer that question in a year or so, but one thing that's been the biggest surprise is that this book has been reviewed in the cultural pages, but it has also been published huge excerpts in the crime pages and in the regular news part of the papers, not just in the cultural sections. So it has been taken by the press as an important story outside of the literary story, which is a complete surprise to me and to everybody. So there hasn't really been a book. There is nautical literature in Mexico, a lot of nautical literature, but there hasn't really been a book about the consequences of the violence in the country on women or young girls. And in fact, one of my complaints always with most of the nautical literature that is written by men is they always have a prostitute, which is the cliche prostitute that we know nothing about, that's never a character, or a girl who works in a table dancing place. And it's always the same girl, and she looks the same in all the novels, and she's also just an object. They're never characters in these books. So the women are objectified in the literature too.
You use poetry and then what seems like her actual testimony to follow up maybe some things that have been too ambiguous.
Mhm.
How was the process of using both poetry and what seems to be maybe an interview or dialogue you had with Suzanne? How did it work? In the way you did it was so cohesive. How did that process go so that it was a cohesive body and it didn't seem like two separate entities?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, the thing is, I lived that time for one, so I knew all the time. And then what I did with Suzanne is that we spent about 3 weeks together going over memories, 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 memories. So even though I have her memories in italics, they were then completely worked by me to be made into pieces that would have a standard, because as she spoke, you know, in the notes or in some of the, she would type sometimes, it was just, you know, it wasn't worked writing. So what and in fact, that book, I wrote it many times. I never could figure out how to write that book because it was such a short period of time. And every time I tried to write it sort of with a narrative sweep, it was wrong. And finally, it just came to me. I was illuminated, and I just realized that I had to write it like a silent movie. So these little scenes, if you see, they're like little silent movie scenes, you know, even the little titles, you know, she is this girl. There she is, you know, blah, blah, blah. And so I really wanted to get in some of the hard facts, but crafted. So it's all super, super crafted. And I wanted to have this dialogue between my poetic voice and a sort of more down to earth narrative, although I made her writing at times poetic also. And then the third thing about that book that's interesting is that I put myself in it. So I appear towards the end of the book, and I decided to put myself in it because I've read a lot about the role of the witness, and there's a lot of books about the importance of the witness. And the witness always says, I was there. I saw it with my own eyes. And I wanted to be the witness of her acts of goodness, her sort of weird, extraordinary behavior that showed compassion. And I felt like the only way that I could do that and be able to have legitimacy is if I said, I saw it. I mean, I actually saw her do this, you know. Mm-hmm.
All of your characters, you write, because you use poetry, sometimes descriptions are a little bit ambiguous or simple, yet you can, if you said Suzanne had compassion, and that was something I could understand through your writing without you having to outright say she had compassion. It was through action, simple phrases, or how she reflected on it. In your writing process, how do you form that? How are you able to form your characters so well that you don't have to go through wordy explanations of their existence? They just simply are that way, and the reader almost instantaneously perceives them as that.
Well, it's that cliche that you've heard in every creative writing class, which is show, don't tell. I mean, I'm always trying to not tell and to show. I mean, it's true that if you show it, it's going to be more powerful than if you tell it. You know, definitely. So I think what I'll read is something uplifting and happy after such a kind of heavy topic. So I really enjoyed giving her a love story. So this is true that in Mexico, because of all the violence, there are all these abandoned properties. And so, you know, from little tiny shacks to mansions that are completely abandoned, that, you know, the owners were killed or they had to flee. And so to me, it's a total sort of Goldilocks story where she can go and try out all the beds and everything. And so she does. She's hired to work at this mansion, but the owners never come back. And suddenly the only people living in this house are Ladydi, who's named after the princess, and Julio the gardener, and the sort of housekeeper cook jacaranda. So they eventually, little by little, just take over the house. So I'm going to read just the beginning where they meet so that you can hear this falling in love at first sight bit. And then I'll go to the end of the chapter where they've taken over the master bedroom and they're both now sleeping in the big bed that looks out over Acapulco Bay and what happens there. And here, I guess, for those of you who are interested in writing, it was very important for me to give Julio a different way of speaking. I wanted to hear his voice. His voice couldn't be like Rita's voice or the drug trafficker's voice or the friends. And I wanted him to have this special voice that you'll hear more in the second half of this reading. But I was very conscious as a writer, again, of saying, okay, how does he speak? What are his speech patterns? How do I make him sound different? And also the way he speaks is going to be seductive to her. It's part of what makes him fascinating. So, the very next morning, Julio, the gardener, walked through the front door and I fell in love. He walked right into my body. He climbed up my ribs and into me. I thought to myself, say a prayer for ladders. I wanted to smell his neck and place my mouth on his mouth and taste him and hold him. I wanted to smell the smell of garden and grass and palm tree, smell of rose and leaf and lemon flower. I fell in love with the gardener, and his name was Julio. I spent the morning following him around the garden. He trimmed, dug, and cut. He rubbed the leaves of a lemon tree between his fingers and smelled them. He took a few flat silver seeds out of the back pocket of his jeans and pressed them into the dirt. He used long shears to cut the grass. After an hour, he left and went to get a ladder from the garage so that he could cut the Mexican pink bougainvillea that grew along one wall and beside the life-sized bronze horse. As he snipped at the overgrown branches, yellow pollen was shaken into the air, and the flowers, like paper flowers, covered the ground. Julio was in his early 20s. His skin was deeply tanned from working in the sun all day. He had a short afro that stood up like a black crown above him and light brown eyes. Julio was kind to the flowers and the leaves. He cupped the roses with his hands as if he was honored to hold them. He twirled vines between his fingers as if they were locks of hair. He walked gently on the grass as if he did not want the small blades to break or even bend under his weight. Plants in my life, plants in my life had always been something to fight against. Trees were filled with tarantulas. Vines strangled everything. Large red ants lived under roots, and snakes hid near the prettiest flowers. I also knew to stay away from the unusual dry brown patches of jungle that were suffocating from the herbicide dropped by the helicopters. The poison would continue to burn through the land for decades. Everyone on my piece of mountain always dreamed of the city and all that cement where no insect survived. We could never imagine why anyone would want a garden. Because I loved Julio, the cars and trucks outside the street sounded like rivers. The diesel smoke from passenger buses smelled like flowers, and the rotten 5-day-old garbage by the front door smelled sweet. Cement walls became mirrors. My small, ugly hands turned into starfish. In those hours that I followed Julio around the garden, he never spoke to me. After Julio left each day, I sat in my room and prayed. I prayed that the beautiful garden of bougainvillea trees, roses, bowers, lemon, and magnolia trees would dry up, and that the lawn would become overgrown with weeds. I prayed that Julio would have to come to the house every day to take care of his sick garden. And then this is when they've taken over the house. From the master bedroom's bay window in the marble house, we could see past the garden and large bronze horse to the bay glittering with night lights. When I looked out after our day trip, I knew a virgin lived under that blue water. Since I was a person who had never experienced cold weather, I loved to close the door and windows and turn up the air conditioning until the room was freezing. My teeth chattered. My teeth seemed almost to break against each other. I had never felt that kind of cold before. I loved it. I even loved the pain. This room is the North Pole, Julio said. He never asked me to turn the air conditioning off. I would gather up all the blankets I could find from around the house and pile them on the bed. I had never slept in a cold room under blankets. This is because you grew up in the jungle, Julio said. I grew up close to the desert, where it can get very cold. At night, in our Acapulco igloo, Julio told me his philosophy. Life is a crazy, out of order, inside out, salt mixed with sugar place, where the drowned can be walking on dry land, he said. Like the best outlaws, I know I'm going to die young. I don't even think about old age. It's not even in my imagination. You have tamed me, I answered. I picked up his hand from the pillow and cuffed it around my wrist. Julio thought people could be divided into day and night people. He said words could be divided this way also. Ugly night words, according to him, were words like rabies and nausea. Pretty night words were words like moon and milk and moth. When Julio and I moved around under the blankets, sparks of electricity crackled and lit up our bed. Never had we seen anything like this before, only in the sky. We would make love in the wool blanket, lightning. So that's the whole second section that, that gives the book a pause, that gives her a love story.
When you were talking to the women you interviewed for the book, did any of them actually speak to you about love? Is that something that you did encounter talking to them?
A lot about love, yes. And usually it was, my life was fine until I met and cut out for the collages, there would be like Brad Pitt, because that would be the manly face they found in the magazine, So it was always a bit funny. But yeah, in the jail, a lot of the women were there because they had gotten involved in dealing drugs or prostitution, or there was usually a bad man's story accompanying what was going on. Yeah. One of the things I always loved to ask the women of the drug traffickers, one of my favorite questions was, so what did he buy you? And it was just always so banal. I remember one woman who was the wife of the pilot of a very important drug trafficker who's now been caught. I said, so what did he buy you? And she said, oh, well, he took me in his airplane to San Antonio, Texas, and he bought me a leather jacket. And I was just thinking, how many people have died because of this leather jacket? It's just so insane, And that's the other thing I should say, as opposed to these terrorist groups have an ideology, as horrible as it may be. But the drug cartels in Mexico, there's no ideology. It's like pure, horrific capitalism in the most terrible form. It's just about money and stuff.
Earlier you were speaking about the girl that we always see in books or in movies, that's the stripper or the prostitute, and how she doesn't really have a face and she always looks the same. But one could say that the same thing could be said about the male villain, like the one that you were describing in your book, that the drug lord, I believe it was, that comes out of the car, and that kind of stock character that we see time and time again, the villain, and yet there doesn't really seem to be a face there either. It also seems to be this inhumane kind of character that comes into stories. So do you think that it's important to give them a voice and to give them a face as well?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. And in fact, not so much in those that go stealing, because she only sees their feet, and it is from her point of view. But for example, with Mike, it was very important for me not to make him be a cliche small-time drug dealer. And one of the things that you know, there are several themes in the novels, but one of the themes is how modern technology has come into these rural communities, be it through television, cellular phones, Facebook. And so with Mike, you know, I wanted to show that he was dealing on Facebook. You know, the spring breakers were coming from the States, but they already had bought their drugs and everything on Facebook, and how Facebook, you know, had taken, which it has, it's taken over even this area of the world. And I did try and make him have sort of these complex sides to him. And also he's very generous to the people in the community. I mean, he deals his pot in Acapulco and everything, but then he's buying them all necklaces and presents. So I was very aware of that, but it's a very good point. I mean, all these are sort of cliched archetypes that we need to be concerned with when we're writing about this stuff. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you, Jennifer, for being here with us this evening.
Thank you.
In the first, in our series, in Dialogue with Writers, if you're interested in reading Jennifer's books, there are copies of Prayers for the Stolen and Widow Basquiat in the Ulivi Library, and also in the Pietra Dialogues student working space. Jennifer will be holding a writing workshop for students this week on Wednesday and Thursday evenings. That's September 24th and 25th from 6 to 7:30 p.m. here in Villa Sassetti. She'll be meeting with a small group of students. I don't know if you want to say a few words about the writing workshop? Or
No, just bring paper and pencil, because mostly we'll be writing in class.
Right. If you're interested in attending, you can RSVP to La Pietra Dialogues, lapietra.dialogues at nyu.edu. And thank you all for being here tonight.
Thank you.